First, I want to thank Chris Kirby and the Ilsley Library for inviting me to speak today about my memoir. Since I'm living in Costa Rica and I published in early January, I really haven't had a chance to speak yet. My book club in Costa Rica read the book, but that's a different experience when your friends sit down and tell you what they think about it. And it's great to be here. I've had a long history with the town of Middlebury. Not only am I a graduate of the college, but I come from a long line of Middlebury graduates, including my father, who's here today with my mother, and they live in Lincoln for the last 28 years. My great-grandfather actually went to Middlebury, and he was from Teignmouth, Vermont. So I have a long connection to Vermont, our family does, and it feels like a second home to me in the US, so it's great to be here. I never meant to be a writer. I have a degree in public administration. I do nonprofit work. When I'm not doing that, I like planting gardens and using tools. But there was a story inside of me that I was carrying for too long. The story began before I was born, when my parents decided to move to South Korea to serve as missionaries with the Presbyterian Church. I was 9 months old when we landed in Seoul. I was the youngest of four, with three older brothers from the ages of 3 to 9. 10 years before that, my father left a position in a successful family insurance business in Niagara Falls, New York, and entered seminary. My parents then served at churches in a small mining town in Ohio in the urban core of Bridgeport, Connecticut. They were social justice-oriented people, and they were called to divided places. After hearing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak, my dad traveled south during Freedom Summer to help register voters. In their work, they deliberately crossed racial and socioeconomic lines. An ad in a Presbyterian church newsletter and a slideshow by a visiting missionary doctor serving in Korea led them to a decision to move their young family across the world. I was too young when we arrived in Korea at 9 months old to go through culture shock or deal with acculturation as my parents did. I was too young to know what it meant that we were leaving the country of my passport behind. Going to Korea is something I don't remember. I woke up to life there, and over 16 years, Korea, its history and its ways became my reference point. I learned to speak Korean as I learned to speak English. For the first 4 years of my life, as my parents were attending language school and beginning to work, I was in the daily care of Korean women, soaking up language, culture, and the customs of one of the most Confucius and homogeneous cultures in the world. I went to Korean nursery school, soaking up even more. Up until the age of 5, in fact, when we first visited the US, Korea was all I remembered and knew. My family was American, but the US was a foreign country. Korea was home. As some background, my family arrived to Korea in 1966. It was a pivotal time in that country's modern history. At that time, South Korea was one of the world's poorest countries. The nation was still recovering from a devastating war, which had decimated the land, caused millions of deaths, left millions disabled, widowed, and orphaned. The war left the country divided in two, a painful division of one country and people that, as you know, has lasted until this very day. The U.S. had over 40,000 troops stationed in South Korea. The border was a tense, so-called demilitarized zone 30 miles from Seoul, and it is and was one of the most militarized places in the world. While daily life in Seoul felt ironically so peaceful most days, tensions flared over the years at that border, with many incidents nearly sparking another war. Countless things happened in those 16 years that gave me my view of the world. Growing up in a developing and divided country with a people of great passion, my parents' involvement in the Korean struggle for human rights and democracy, my close relationship with a woman we called Ajamoni, a widow who worked in our home for 12 years, my mom's work with single mothers and her involvement with Korean women's rights activists, 11 years at an international school with a community of students and teachers who came from all over the world. And if the story ended there, it would be a story of a complicated and rich childhood in a place of contrast and contradiction, in a humble ancient nation far away from the home of my ancestors. A story of a girl, part Korean, part American, always something in between. But something happened after my family left Korea. I was 16 when we left. I didn't really have a clear understanding of what leaving meant. It was in the US that I first learned what culture shock felt like. I was a college student at Middlebury, in fact. hi Tom from Middlebury, when I began to suffer from depression and a feeling of deep dislocation. Middlebury is an amazing school, but I had moved from a bustling, sensory overload Asian city and international school with students from over 35 countries represented to a largely monocultural college in a small American town. I looked and sounded like an American, but in reality, I needed a host family. There was no social media to connect me to my international school friends, now scattered all over the world. We lost contact with the lady we called Ajamoni, who was as dear to me as a grandmother, and I began to grieve the loss of all of it as if I was grieving a death. Without any language to understand my situation, I went through that grief alone. With anyone who knew me before Middlebury, I lived life as a half-self, trying to start from scratch in a culture I didn't fully understand but was expected to. I didn't feel American, and I didn't look Korean. And I was beginning to understand that leaving Korea, life as I had known it, was over. While psychologists at that time understood concepts like culture shock and acculturation for adults who moved overseas, few understood the effects of reverse culture shock, especially for children who had been raised far away from their passport countries. These days, there are numerous books and resources for something called third culture kids. That is, children who are raised in a culture other than their parents' culture for a significant number of their development years. Third culture kids are said to carry the influence of their parents' culture and the culture of the country or countries in which they were raised, but they don't have full ownership of any of them. TCKs, as they're called, it turns out, often experience some period of cultural rootlessness when they return to their passport countries. So after college, I moved from state to state and job to job, searching for a purpose to my life and somewhere to belong. And even while I had good friends and good work, I really grappled with feelings of dislocation. As anyone who's gone through grief or loss knows, there's no timeline for healing. And if that grief is somehow ambiguous or complicated, the process of healing is difficult to begin. Ambiguous loss is described as loss someone goes through, for example, when someone they love is missing but never found. You go through partial stages of grief, but you can never go through them all. You don't know what you're grieving for. Processing grief requires a starting point. We need an ending, or to know there is no ending. My life in Korea had ended, but Korea was there. We lost contact with Ajamoni, but she was alive. Our community was spread all over the world, but they were alive too. So what was I grieving for? 8 years ago, I began to write Rituals of Separation as a love song to a cross-cultural childhood and as an exploration of the complexity of issues of loss, belonging, and cultural identity. I wrote to answer these very questions and to give a voice to people with complicated cultural identities who have lived stories we can't always see in their faces. As novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says, there is a danger in telling a single story, to show a people as one thing and only one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. About 10 years ago, when I was living in Minneapolis, I went to the Walker Art Museum to see an exhibit by a contemporary Korean artist whose name is Minuk Lim. Through her work, Lim explores the loss of an alienation that has taken place as Korean society compressed a century of industrialization into a single generation. One of Lim's explanations of her work struck me. Today, under the changes caused by globalization, she said, places are counted only as space. Individuals are merely a resource or networking. Nietzsche was said to have wept as he embraced a downtrodden horse, but I want to weep embracing places. Nevertheless, I want to fight against the sense of powerlessness caused by melancholy. So I'm venting rituals for and keeping records of moments of separation. So I was struck by this when I started writing this idea of the powerlessness caused by melancholy. The writing of the book was for me a ritual of separation, not to separate from Korea, but to memorialize that time, to make record of and acknowledge the lasting impact of that country and its history and people on my identity, to say the names of those people I could not forget, that I carried with me from Seoul to Middlebury to Boston to Seattle. I wrote to help me better understand from what matter I and we are culturally formed, and the role of my hidden bicultural identity in that struggle. Over 8 years with each chapter, I peeled away another onion skin of belonging, Writing allowed me to begin to fully answer the seemingly simple question that I literally sometimes sigh when I hear, "Where are you from?" With each chapter, I took one more step in answering that question. So I'd like to read a couple passages from my book to you. And this first chapter is from towards the beginning of the book and describes a bit about our life when we first arrived in Seoul. And it's called Santoki, which means mountain rabbit. And it's a Korean children's song that all Korean children learn. And I learned before I remember learning it. Santoki tokiya, 어디를 가느냐, 강주 뛰면서 어디를 가느냐. Mountain bunny, bunny, where are you going? Bouncing, bouncing as you're running, where are you going? A few years after we arrived in Korea, National Geographic published an article called South Korea, Success Story in Asia. The country's rapid industrialization and war recovery was making record books. In 1966, the country did not quite look like a place of miracles. But of course, what a place looks like is a relative thing. My parents looked out over the muddy banks of the Han River and watched women beat their clothes clean against rocks as their children ran along nearby sandbanks. They stood near the edge of Cheonggyecheon Stream in downtown Seoul and saw sewage spilling from the dilapidated, stilted shacks of former war refugee families from the north. Beggars with missing limbs howled in torn rags through city markets. Mom and Dad could better understand when they saw these people in these parts of the city that only 13 years had passed since someone who walked the war-torn peninsula said, "This land is the most devastated land on earth." But the low-lying city of sorrow was becoming a city of hope. Seoul was rebuilding, expanding, and improving its infrastructure. The country was emerging from years of poverty and instability. A wide boulevard led from the grand Renaissance-style City Hall to Gyeongbok Palace, the 500-year-old palace of Korea's last nobles. The House of Yi was deposed by Japanese colonialists in the first decade of the 20th century, and the expansive palace grounds had long ago become a city park, making it a perfect place for family picnics along Lotus Pond pavilions once used to host court banquets. It would take some years before I understood that our industrious Cheofrol downtown core was recently marked by cavernous shell holes, and much of the city was left in ruins. I thought Admiral Yi and his turtle boat statue had been there forever, that my city had always looked like this. But Bondo Hotel, arcade, busy open markets, full universities, and the well-to-do customers, once again climbing the grand staircase of Shinsegae department store, told the story of Seoul's reemergence as much as Cheonggyecheon told the story of its recent tragedy. Growing up in Korea during this time shaped what I came to believe about almost everything. I knew something good could emerge from broken places, and I understood a place of growing peace could carry immeasurable underlying sorrow and turbulence. We arrived in Seoul on an evening of torrential and seasonal rains. The airport welcome of Reverend Che and his family was an unannounced surprise that deeply touched my parents. It meant so much to Mom and Dad that people who didn't personally know them, who they had met their daughter in the United States, had traveled across the city to welcome us into their country. This first gesture spoke volumes about the Korean capacity to show kindness and concern. The arrival of a representative from the mission community was an expected official pickup that deeply relieved my parents. From that moment on, with these two blessings, I became something in between. I was entering a childhood of blurred cultural lines, and in that moment of arrival, I began to unconsciously reconcile, balance, and become shaped by two different worlds. We moved into a neighborhood of rice paddy fields, sloped hills, open markets, and corner stores. Our house was in Sodaemun, the west district of Seoul, in the shadow of Ansan, the mountain missionaries called Saddleback. Our two-story stone home sat in the wooded area in the back of campus of Yonsei, a prominent university founded by pioneering missionaries. My brother's foreign school was a 10-minute walk away. In the morning, the steady tok-tok-tok of the hollow wooden moktak gong and the chants of early rising monks at the Buddhist temple up the hill commenced the day. The honks of buses and taxis soon joined in the chorus of a bustling neighborhood at peace, a capital city on the rise. Mom and Dad cobbled together incoherent conversations about buying groceries and making meals with our new staff. Mrs. Kim was our maid, and Mr. No was the person missionaries called the outside man. My parents tried to figure out just where the market was and what they might buy there without speaking any Korean. Mr. No was aghast when Dad tried to work in the yard. Mrs. Kim laughed when Mom stepped into the kitchen to cook, shooing her away. My parents had always done these things for themselves. They were industrious people who liked doing things for themselves, but there were new rules to follow, a different set of protocols to learn to live by. One morning, a few weeks later, my parents walked down our driveway to the forested lane that led through the campus to Yonsei's well-respected language school. My brothers Rick and Chris took the same lane past college buildings, through pine trees, walking further through the campus to Seoul Foreign School, where my oldest brothers joined a tight and diverse kindergarten through high school community of missionary, business, and diplomat kids. After my parents and big brothers left, Mrs. Kim's niece, the woman I soon called Big Sister, leaned over and swung me onto her back. Onni held me there as she pulled a thick quilt podegi around us, wrapping me tightly in place. While my parents were away learning a new language and my two oldest brothers were making new friends, Onni and Mrs. Kim carried me like they were once carried, like their mothers and grandmothers had been carried. Not from a culture of high chairs, they didn't put me down to eat. Not from a people of cribs and prams, they didn't put me down to sleep. Mom was worried I would become bow-legged. She asked Dad, after finding me in this cozy position again and again upon returning home in the afternoon, "Honey, how will Elizabeth learn to walk?" Baby wearing was a way to keep children close and safe while shopping in the market, washing clothes, and bending into a rice paddy. But I know I felt more than practicality to this gesture, to the way I was held so close to Mrs. Kim, heartbeat to heartbeat. This practice was part of a larger sentiment that I began to unconsciously feel then, an unspoken understanding that humans needed and wanted to be physically close to the people who loved and cared for them. My family had crossed the world, and there was insecurity in crossing from one life to the next. But I was safe and secure. I had as much loving care as any child could ask for. I was marking a cake with a bee with Mom, and I was asking the mountain rabbit where he was going, singing San Toki, Tokiya, Ori do Kananya. The challenges ahead for my parents would not include putting food on the table and making ends meet. There would be a lean missionary budget to manage, and my parents almost went into debt their first year paying school fees for Mrs. Kim and Mr. No's children. But they found this all extremely and starkly relative when they saw rag pickers sort through our garbage. They passed tents in the neighborhood below us, hovels where families somehow seemed to manage to survive and make some sort of life, even in the bitter cold of winter. They heard stories of orphan children who roamed the city after the war ended. Dust of the streets, they were called. Like the widows, the severely disabled, and the broken families, these children were collateral damage of a war of proxy, a war that changed everything. My caretaker, Onni, had known heartache my family did not know. One day, she told my parents a story. When North Korea attacked Seoul in 1950, she and her brother ran out of the house to find safety. In that one moment of confusion, they were separated. She never saw him again. She didn't know if he was dead, if he was wounded, or if he was still alive somewhere north of the DMZ borderline that separated one Korea into two. I was too young to ask questions then, to say, "Big sister, are you still sad? Big sister, what was your brother like? How many days, weeks, months, and years did you look for him? Do you look for him still?" I was too young to understand she carried sorrow in her heart as she carried me on her back. Mom told me that on some days when my parents were away, Mrs. Kim took me to her home. We left by the old farmer's path, following the same trail I walked for 16 years when I cut through Yonsei University, until one day the path gave way to a large dormitory hall. Down the hill from the ivy-covered buildings, green hedges, and stone missionary homes of Yonsei was the world of Seoul. Tile and tin roof homes met the walls of makeshift shacks. Fried fish odors and pit toilet smells, dish clanks, and thousands of years of a common way of life linked one house to the next. Young girls took turns jumping over long stretch rubber bands. Boys stood in small circles, using the instep of their feet to pass tasseled, chegi hacky sacks high into the air. The low walls surrounding homes gave privacy to the madang, the courtyard, where women washed clothes, dried peppers in the sun, prepared winter kimchi in large batches. When fall came, the women of each family turned high mounds of salted Napa cabbage heads into the spicy fermented dish so essential to life that a woman's ability to handle the affairs of her household was said to be measured by its tastefulness. and I began to love the taste of Mrs. Kim's fermented cabbage. I walked on chubby toddler legs between the large brown crocks that lined her courtyard, squatting down next to earthenware ongi vessels that held the homemade condiments fundamental to Korean cooking, the condiments that soon became as much a part of me as Mrs. Kim's language did. The kanjang soy sauce she sprinkled onto my rice, the deep red gochujang paste too spicy for my baby tongue, the doenjang paste, soybean paste, whose acrid odor drifted lazily through the air as it fermented outdoors, aging in thick brown blocks on her neighbor's walls. I spent my afternoons with big brothers who were putting up tents and lighting anthills on fire as they were learning to balance who they were before Korea with who they were becoming. Our yard buzzed with activity. The pop of Rick's air rifle, the crack of a baseball hitting Chris's leather glove, Mark's cheery chattering, the footsteps of Mr. No, who tended the rose bushes, checked on the groaning furnace, and kept watch at night. I was in the middle of it all, a happy, social baby who was learning that a city was a tactile place, commuting to church was a contact sport, and shopping, cooking, and life happened in the open air. I was learning to expect hands pressed onto our backs in the thick crowds at the market and people pressed shoulder to shoulder on the city bus. I grew stout on rice gruel as I began to understand the world as a place of busgirls and street vendors, caretakers and outside men, old and new, wealth and poverty, concrete, dirt, and tile. My parents came home one day from language school to find out I had spoken my first words, and I had spoken them in Korean. I was acquiring Korean without effort, as I acquired English without effort, like bilingual children so easily do. A transformation was underway. Mark was now also Maga. Chris was Kurisu. Rick was Riki. The R turned into more of an L sound. My dad was Appa and Mom was Oma. I was Elizabeth and Liji. We were still us, but we were becoming another us. When November came, Mom traveled across the city to Eastgate Market. She meandered through what seemed to her to be an endless number of stalls and floor levels to find a traditional first birthday hanbok for her baby girl, a style of dress with roots 2,000 years old. With Korea's high infant mortality rates, a child reaching the age of 100 days, let alone 1 year, was worthy of great celebration. The arms of my green chogori top were banded with bright colors of yellow, pink, green, purple, and red. Intricate embroidery of pheasants, chrysanthemums, and Chinese characters adorned the silk top and red chima skirt. My parents had not come to Korea to stick to their own customs. They wanted to celebrate my birthday in the local way. They knew the importance of the birthday dress, but they had only heard a bit about the ceremony that should take place. They saw photos of ornately dressed children sitting in front of a low table full of seasonal fruits and stacks of colorful rice cakes. Various other items were placed on the table: a spool of thread, a paintbrush, a pencil, a book, money, a pair of scissors. They understood something about the family gathering to see which item the child reached for or picked up first, and that people believed this gesture foretold their child's future. If the baby chose the stack of won bills, she would be wealthy. If she picked up a pencil, she would be a successful scholar. If she picked up the thread and needle, she would live a long life. Instead of choosing an item of destiny that day, I dug my fingers into pink chiffon birthday cake. My first birthday was some balance of who I was by birth and ancestry and who I was becoming because of my parents' answer to a call, somewhere between ancient Confucian rites and Betty Crocker. I learned so many things that year I don't remember learning. A children's song about a mountain rabbit, words of a language that would never sound foreign to me, that a person's life trajectory could be determined by reaching out for a thread instead of a pencil, the ways of women who held me close to their body warmth as they made my family's first year in Korea possible. I always understood I was a Miguk Sadam, an American. I knew I was not ethnically Korean. The children of Seoul, the ones I did not know, reminded me of this each day for 16 years with their calls. Miguk Sadam, they shouted day in and day out. Miguk Sadam was merely a rank in my taxonomic category: kingdom, Animalia; phylum, Chordata; species, Miguk Sadam. We weren't immigrants. My parents didn't cross the seas for economic opportunity. We weren't refugees forced away from our home country by war, famine, or persecution. We would never apply for Korean citizenship. Every time we arrived to Kimpo Airport, we were asked, "What is the purpose of your visit? How long will you be staying?" We were officially foreigners. I was technically an alien. We didn't have family to the north of the militarized border that separated one Korea into two. Mom didn't keep our ketchup and mayonnaise in earthen crocks, nor had my grandparents lived through a terrible war on their soil. My ancestors weren't buried under the sloped green mounds that dotted our hillsides, the ancient cemeteries that captured my heart. Only now do I see something ambiguous to our landing, an in-between place I would always occupy. But these distinctions didn't matter to me then. From the moment my life in Korea started, 1,000 things began to separate me from the people of my bloodline and the country of my passport. My umbilical cord of identity stretched out to the city and to the people in front of me, to a young Korean woman I called older sister, to an American Korean man named Horace Underwood, to a mountain we called Saddleback, to a wide river to our south that had witnessed centuries of change. Closing one life door had opened up another. I was becoming part of a new family, not bound by blood or nationality, but created out of calling and circumstance and the simple fact of what happens when a little girl's parents decide to make a home in a new land. Nothing about that life or my identity felt particularly remarkable until I came to the U.S. Nothing about my place in between cultures and communities, between fundamentally different ways of understanding the world, seemed like something I needed to reconcile until the day we left Korea behind. I only look back now and try to analyze this time, to pick it apart, to understand the people and places that were forming me, to remember the waves of those who were teaching me how to greet and grieve. That September, as I began to hear the refrains of Korea, I began to understand the words of my parents and the words of Mrs. Kim. I began to understand the world in some patchwork way, like a pojegi cloth, with pieces of fabric that didn't seem to belong together, but somehow, when laid one next to one to the other, made a whole. Days and then months passed in Korea. Months, then years passed away from the U.S. The country of my passport, the home of my ancestors, lay far over the horizon. Arirang, Arirang, Koreans sang in melodic voices from picnic sites to national halls, calling the refrain of a national song of love and loss thousands of years old. There, over that mountain, is Paektu Mountain, where even in the middle of winter days, flowers bloom. And these melodies, their haunting highs and lows, their cadence of joy and sorrow, and the people who sang them began to take over my heart. Okay, I think I have time to read one more chapter. I'm going to move on quite a bit here. As some bit of background, this chapter is called Axe Murders, Self-Immolations, and Assassinations. And so peace in Korea is, as I'm sure all are hearing about, and has been since the war ended, quite tenuous. In fact, the war never officially was over. It ended in a truce, so there was no official war to the end to the Korean War. My parents understood pretty quickly that what this meant. For example, in 1968, a band of 30 North Korean soldiers secretly infiltrated Seoul and came within a few hundred yards of the president's house before they were identified. A firefight broke out for the next few days. Those who escaped were hiding in our neighborhood mountains. So incidents like this continued off and on over the years. My parents had become very aware because of their interest in social issues. They sought out this knowledge and became aware of it through different ways, but they were aware early on of the abuses of the Park Chung-hee government. President Park Chung-hee came to power in a military coup in the early 60s. He won one election, and then he began amending the Constitution so he could just run again and again. Over the years, his regime took more and more power, and people were arrested and tortured who spoke up publicly against his government. College students were demonstrating regularly on campuses while I was growing up for freedom of press and speech, and they continued to do so for years. Koreans are people of protest, and that hasn't changed now either. So this chapter takes place in the early 70s. I'm in elementary school, and by this time my parents are deeply involved in a group called the Monday Night Group. It's a small group of activists who met in our living room and in the living rooms of other members to try to do something about the human rights situation in Korea. So axe murders, self-immolations, and assassinations. Every few weeks, our Girl Scout troop gathered in the open concept area between the 5th and 6th grade classrooms to make sit-upons, earn badges, and pledge to be honest and fair and help where we were needed. Each meeting began with the Girl Scout promise. On my honor, I will try to serve God and my country, to help people at all times, and to live by the Girl Scout law. I was fully on board with the Girl Scouts, especially since Mom said I could buy a Girl Scout knife. But there was just one problem. I wasn't sure which country we were referring to, but I had a strong feeling we were talking about the U.S. Citing the Girl Scout promise was similar to reciting the Nicene Creed at church. I chose not to dwell on the many questions it brought up, such as, just who were the Nicenes? Why did they need a creed? And why are we saying it now? Do I believe in the Holy Catholic Church? I don't even know what that means. And does it make sense to promise to serve a country I have lived in for 1 year? The words to the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance felt even more misplaced in Seoul, even further removed from what was happening across the city at the Blue House. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all? Where was that happening? Park Chung-hee was the only president I had ever known. Since his 18-year rule practically defined South Korea's formation after 1961, it was hard for me not to feel some begrudging respect for the stern-faced man who looked down at me from the government portrait that hung on our police station wall year after year. As the U.S. transformed under the distinctly different leadership styles and philosophies of Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford, we had Park. I took his presidency for granted, as if he and his official photo would always be there. Apparently that was his plan too. Despite coming to power in a military coup, Park was popular with the U.S. government for politically stabilizing South Korea. In 1967, the U.S. ambassador to South Korea said Park was the, quote, prototype for the new political figure because he had been exposed to the ways and ideas of the outside world. Many Koreans and long-term missionaries championed him as an industrializer who was moving South Korea into a new modern era. His ambitious economic programs and anti-communist, pro-capitalist views made him a friend to the U.S. In August of '74, my family was glued to NBC News. Reporters were speaking in mournful voices. We learned that while President Park was giving a formal speech at the National Theater in celebration of Korea's independence from Japan, a man in the audience, a Japanese-born Korean, pulled out a gun and took a shot. He missed the president and hit the president's wife, killing her with a misfire. I remember the day when thousands of citizens lined the main boulevard downtown as the motorcade carrying the First Lady's body passed through the heart of the city. Unlike her husband, the president's wife exuded down-to-earth kindness. She came from a wealthy background, but she seemed to be able to cut through the thick barriers of social class. Newspaper articles talked about her visiting elders and orphans. She engaged with the poor and the sick. She worked on behalf of women's rights, mentally challenged kids, leprosy patients. She was highly revered, and I really admired her. Not long after she died, I carefully placed a series of stamps memorializing her into my stamp book. 1 year after the First Lady was killed, another incident shocked me out of my international school complacency. In the months before I turned 11, a group of U.S. soldiers were dispatched on a routine detail to prune a large tree that blocked the sightline from the United Nations command checkpoint at the DMZ into North Korea. Considered a provocation, the soldiers were attacked by a group of North Korean soldiers. A few U.S. soldiers were hacked to death. The nation was on high alert. A photo captured the moment. One group of soldiers was running frantically away from another group who were wielding axes. Two ladders were leaning nonchalantly against a tree as if someone was about to pick fruit. The photos were blurry, so I couldn't tell who was hacking and who was running from getting hacked. But the incident taxed my young brain. Actually, I was horrified. A person could be hacked to death with an axe over the trimming of a tree? Korean media didn't shy away from graphic detail. I was still thinking from time to time about Chun Tae-il, the 17-year-old who set himself on fire in protest at the Peace Market, in frustration that his efforts to make conditions better for fellow sweatshop workers were going nowhere. He was said to have chanted as he went down in flames, "Observe the Labor Standard Act, we are not machinery." His story was famous in Korea. The English word they used for his action was self-immolated. This sounded like a terrible way to die. Self-immolation, axe murders, militarized borders, assassinated first ladies, chanting for justice as you go down in flames. Our peaceful land of the morning calm could be so intense. 3 days after the axe murders, in a maneuver called Operation Paul Bunyan, 2 8-man teams of military engineers were sent in to cut down the tree. In the show of strength, 2 security platoons, 1 South Korean Special Forces team, a U.S. infantry company of over 20 helicopters was sent in as backup. A number of Air Force jets and U.S. aircraft carriers were deployed. The task force included over 800 men. United Nations Command notified North Korea minutes before their arrival that their work party was there in order to peacefully finish the work left unfinished. Over 100 heavily armed North Korean troops arrived to the scene. They set up machine gun positions and watched as the tree was taken down. Just a stump was left standing. Later that day, United Nations Command received a message from Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, expressing regret for the incident without taking full responsibility. Another incident had passed without war. Again, the nation asked, where is the tipping point? The government regularly warned us of the threat that could come from the north. 3-wheeled government trucks passed slowly and methodically through my neighborhood. The men sitting in the front seat called out serious warnings in deep-throated voices, cautioning us about diligence and safety through cheap microphones. On most days, this roving reminder was like background noise until a voice sounded more frantic than authoritarian, and then we knew to begin to worry. I only knew shadow stories about North Korea, rumors of what life was like in a place of mass rallies, work camps, cooperative farms, and the man the people worshiped called the dear leader. I knew South Koreans were supposed to hate North Korea, to think of it as a bad place with bad people, in spite of the fact that so many people had relatives there. My parents told me that people in the North were Koreans too, and that many of them had family in the South. They said they hoped that two Koreas could be one again. They said some of our friends' families came from North Korea. Sigmund Rhee, their boss, who lived in New York City, hadn't seen his siblings or parents for 20 years. I couldn't hate North Korea. I couldn't hate a country in which our friends' relatives lived, a country Ajumoni's husband's family once came from, but I knew not to talk about North Korea in public. I knew not to pull out a camera and start snapping pictures. Seoul was a city on high alert. Pictures could get into communist hands. While pictures of palace rooms were fine, mountain pictures were questionable. I did not even think of taking pictures from the airplane window. A photo could fall into the wrong hands, and someday, because of my snapshot, a city might get bombed. I never once thought it might be appropriate to ask Ajumoni over a bowl of spicy noodles, "So Ajumoni, what do you think about the president?" By middle school, I was a well-trained citizen of Seoul. When sirens blew shrill on the 15th of each month, I ducked inside the lobby of whatever building was closest to me to wait out the monthly air drill. I stood quietly passing time with whoever else happened to be on the same street corner at the same moment the drill commenced. I stood with ladies carrying bags of produce and men yawning and smoking cigarettes. I stood with stooped, wrinkled grandmothers. I stood with young children who looked at me and said, "Hello, what time is it?" and giggled. This was apparently what one needed to do when a tense enemy border was 30 miles away and dangerous commies were over that border. I was standing in the lobby of a 5-story office building. We were yawning, carrying fruit, smoking cigarettes, and ready for war. A strict midnight curfew kept Seoul dark and quiet at night. The government said a dark city was a safe city. A scurry of activity began as 11 p.m. approached. Citizens completed like musical chairs for empty taxis. People squeezed into cabs with strangers if the driver deemed their destination close enough. One day I asked Dad about the thick black pen lines blotting out an article in Time magazine. Dad said the government didn't want people to know certain truths. He told me this was called censorship. I wondered in what grim, windowless building workers were covering up paragraphs about demonstrations, military dictatorships, and opposition leader Kim Dae-jung. When the workers went home each night after a long day of stifling the truth, did they whisper their secrets to their families? How many college tuitions, mortgages, and apartment rentals were paid with these salaries? What did they say if asked, "What work do you do?" And did the government know the censorship only made me want to read these articles more? In one way, President Park's ambitious development plans were working. South Korea was industrializing at an astounding pace. Work was underway on another bridge to span the Han River. Jackhammers cracked into the ground in every corner of the city. The New Village movement sought to inspire citizens to modernize remote country villages mired in poverty. Saemal Undong came with government money, uniforms, hats, pins, and theme songs. People chanted, "Manse," the old Korean battle cry, "May Korea live 10,000 years." The government encouraged full participation based on concepts of diligence and self-help. The songs were sung so energetically that I wanted to sing along, to get up, to not be idle one more minute. I will clean my room. I will walk sport around the yard. I will finish my homework. Senior citizens swept the streets of our neighborhood in smart uniforms, sweeping up candy wrappers and plastic yogurt cups with brooms made out of sticks and straw. Neighborhoods of dilapidated one-story homes we had passed for years were being bulldozed, transformed seemingly overnight into clusters of cheaply made concrete apartments and office buildings. One year, on the way to Techon Beach, we were shocked to see that almost all of the thatched roofs had been replaced with orange tile, which from the comfort of a Nissan Bluebird felt like a loss for Korea. Pictures of Pak appeared on the front page of the newspaper each week, standing next to new oil refineries, watching as country people tried out new farm machinery. A century of growth was being compressed into a single generation. The collective loss of the prior decades was poured into concrete and mixed into steel. It was as if in taking down the past, it could be forgotten. Forget historical preservation. South Korea pushed forward at any cost, even the cost of human life. The world applauded Pak and his miracle on the Han River, but my parents said this miracle was happening on the backs of ordinary people. The Peace Market, Pyeonghwa Sijang, was made up of a series of long city blocks of 6-story cement buildings. It served as Seoul's main center for wholesale textile and apparel goods. The market was established after the end of the Korean War next to Cheonggyecheon Stream, near the neighborhood of stilted shacks occupied by displaced families. By the time I remember, the shacks were torn down, the stream was cemented over by a road, with an elevated roadway constructed above street level. Pyeonghwa Sijang was the workplace of Chun Tae-il. It didn't seem very peaceful in the Peace Market. One day, when Mom and I were visiting the market, we turned into one of the inner buildings. Mom led us up a narrow set of stairs. I don't remember why we went there that day, but I remember a set of dilapidated wooden stairs and taking them one at a time, slowly but steadily, as I followed my determined mother deep into another level of Seoul. The top step opened into a low-ceiling room lit by one bare bulb. The space felt tight. The air smelled stale of people who had been sitting for too long in a room without adequate ventilation. The smell of textile goods was strong. Dozens of young women were hunched over antiquated sewing machines. As we entered, a few of them looked up at us and then quickly returned to their work. The atmosphere grew tense. Mom spoke a few words with a man who seemed like he was in charge. After that, we didn't stay long. As we left, weaving our way out of the tangle of the marketplace, Mom told me she and her friend Linda Jones were trying to help factory and garment workers get better conditions. She told me young women were suffering severe eye strain, working on assembly lines, looking through microscopes to solder computer chips onto motherboards for electronic computer firms like Motorola and Control Data, while making 8 times less than their U.S. counterparts. Not long before that day, unbeknownst to me, Mom had visited one of these sweatshops with a Fulbright scholar to interview workers about their conditions. Since she couldn't afford an inconspicuous transistor recorder, Mom and her colleague carried a recording device the size of a large movie camera into the small space. The story was later broadcast on NPR in the U.S., the country in which many of the garments made in the Peace Market ended up. Not long ago, I asked Mom if she remembered why we went to the Peace Market that particular day. She paused, thought for a minute, and said, "I probably wanted you to see where your clothes were made." Opposition to President Pak was relatively quiet after the unrest following the change to the Constitution in the late 60s. In the 70s, tensions escalated again. Pak narrowly defeated opposition leader Kim Dae-jung, began a third term as president, amid charges of voter fraud. The next month, Kim Dae-jung was run over by a truck and permanently injured. Not long after the election, Pak declared a state of emergency. He imposed martial law, suspended the Constitution, dissolved the National Assembly, closed universities, prohibited all political activity, and began strict censorship of the press. My parents were learning about arrests of academics, laborers, journalists, and clergy who worked with labor unions. I don't remember a childhood time without weeks, days, and months marked and punctuated by cycles of curfew and air raid drills, demos and army maneuvers as if they were regular seasons. The fact that we lived under a military dictatorship or under martial law never hit me over the head. It was more of a quiet tap on the shoulder. Sure, the presidential picture on the wall never changed. Yes, army trucks passed through the city and countryside with regularity. Soldiers were stationed in the bunkers near our cabin at the beach, and there was that threatening country to our north, but none of this was new or surprising. What was surprising was to realize this was not true in every country. Presidents changed. Army convoys weren't rolling through U.S. towns on a regular basis. Not every vacation cottage was surrounded by bunkers and patrolled by soldiers with automatic rifles and submachine guns. Sinchon, the hub of our West District, was full of life. The handmade furniture stores had become flower shops and pop music stores. Well-stocked stationery emporiums carried an endless variety of quality pens and paper. At night, rock and roll beats pumped out of the bars with names like Harlem. The main road of Sinchon dead-ended in the front gate of Yonsei University. During the 70s, Yonsei became a hub of student and anti-government protests. For a few years, the protests happened almost every week. In a strange way, they became commonplace, but we never knew when a routine demonstration might escalate into a violent encounter. When riot police were deployed, we tried to avoid the front gate of Yonsei altogether, but this was nearly impossible. Our house was just down the road. Because of this, I witnessed many demonstrations throughout the years, and I was caught more than once within breathing distance of thick clouds of pepper gas, within sight of Molotov, cocktail, and rock-throwing students. Mom told us to refer to the riots as protests or demonstrations. She said we should call the activists protesters, not dissidents. She wanted to make sure we got these things right. She felt strongly that definitions and labels mattered. I heard her correct Dad sometimes. Honey, don't call them that. Mom might have been the one to teach me the politically correct way to refer to demonstrations, but it was Korea that was teaching me how to live quite normally in the midst of unrest and unpredictability. Sometimes protests ignited at our neighborhood campus. President Park was using torture and arrest to clamp down on freedom. The country I called home was rumbling for democracy and restless for change. My parents' involvement in the struggle for human rights would be one of my childhood's most profound lessons. Okay. That's it. So, Chris, we have time for questions?
Time for questions. We'll have some.
Have you been back many times?
I have. Yeah, it's hard to know what to focus on when I'm reading this book. There's lots of directions I could go. Part of this story is, like I talked about at the beginning, the feelings of loss I went through after I left Korea. The longest I was away was 10 years, and that was when that loss just became like a death to me. And, you know, I'm not a citizen of Korea, so going back to work there is a bit complicated. I have to, you know, it's not like going back to your home country and just show up and find a job. And I couldn't find an avenue through which I wanted to work. So after 10 years, I just realized I just need to go home. You know, a lot of people can go home. I can go home. I'm not a refugee from a place that's closed off to me. And I realized I needed to go to begin healing. So I went for the first time after 10 years. It was very healing for me. That was probably 15 years ago, and ever since then I go every 2 to 3 years. I still haven't lived there again, but I might. I last went in April, just a couple months ago, and it's still home. It's changed a lot, and actually for a while I would go back and think it's changed so much, it's not the same place. And somehow going back this time, it's like I've come full circle and Korea has too. This time I felt like, wow, it feels so much the same. So yeah, I make it a point to do that. And actually my brother Chris has moved to Korea with his wife. They're with Mennonite Central Committee. So we have family back in Korea now, which is great. Yeah. Yeah.
Did the president die in office?
He was assassinated by, ironically, a member of his Korean CIA. So he was assassinated. That put into play another coup. Chun Doo-hwan was president after that for a while. They went through a number of different people. It was 1987 was the final kind of democracy uprising that made it so free and fair elections started. So he was president for 18 years. He probably would have been until he died had he not been assassinated. Yeah. Yes?
I'm curious, now that you live in Costa Rica, How does Costa Rica fit in as far as, does it feel like a third home? I mean, it's your home now. I'm just wondering, and do you speak Spanish fluently yet?
Not yet. I'm working on that.
Yeah.
It's a good question. In some ways, going to Costa Rica was going home for me. There's a lot of familiarity in Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a mix of things, but it's in some places still developing, some places quite wealthy. But I live in a more rural area, and there's a lot of very familiar feeling, everything from like metal doors that pull down and lock, in businesses, to a little bit more security in homes with bars and windows. It's a little bit of a slower pace, or more relational, I would say, which Korea was at that time. Very relational, very family-oriented, which Korea also is and was. And I'm very comfortable outside of the U.S. It's just because it's my identity. It's nothing about the U.S. I'm more comfortable in places where I sort of don't belong. I mean, I belong, but it's like I'm an outsider, but I'm an insider because of, you get to know people or whatever. That's my comfort zone. So in that way, I really like it. But anywhere in the world has its challenges. And as you realize, as a third culture kid or a kid who grew up in South Korea, it doesn't mean you're going to make it anywhere in the world. I write about, and towards the end of the book, as I'm trying to kind of find my balance of identity. And I moved to Costa Rica, like, oh, this will be great. It's like, going overseas again. I'm going to live internationally. And I shocked myself on the same light twice. I kept trying to change the clock every night until I realized that the electricity went off every day, and so that was pointless. I got a terrible eye infection. It's like, you think you're like, oh yes, I'm going to live this exotic international life, but it's life. Life is life everywhere. So yes and no. I mean, in some ways, it's very comfortable, and I think what you would hear from a lot of kids like me who grew up in a country like so different from the U.S., where it's homogeneous and you don't look like the people there, is that you got used to that. That's what I knew. So people staring or asking where you're from, that was normal. So when you come back to the U.S., it's actually quite isolating because you're really anonymous, and you kind of like walk into a mall and you're like, oh my God, I look like everybody. It's kind of a weird feeling at first. I got used to it. I lived in the U.S. a long time, but sticking out is more normal for a lot of kids that grow up that way. So for them, a lot of the isolation is not just in how they feel in public, but even how friends perceive them. Because it's hard for us to get past what we see and hear. I speak English fluently. I obviously look, whatever, you know what I mean by I say look American. I don't look like I could pass as an American. It's not unreasonable to think that. And so at somewhere like Middlebury, where you come there with whatever you've grown up with, it was really hard to explain that. I was really defined by a very different experience, not just Korea, but all of the stuff that was going on with politics, with my parents' involvement with the human rights movement, not just around Confucian culture in a country that was thousands of years old, but a place that had known war and division, and we were close to Korean people. They were as close to us as anybody. And it was a world of, and I grew up in this world of mission, a very diverse mission community of sacrifice. So everything was about like you go and you give yourself to the mission, or you're called somewhere. So to go to a college where it was like, I really had to figure out like, okay, why am I here? Okay, now what do I do after? Like, I'm supposed to get a job somewhere and make money and have a house. Like, I didn't even get it. It wasn't on my radar screen because no one did that when I was growing up. Everyone was called somewhere. So I was kind of waiting, like, where's my call? I'm waiting for the call here, And I didn't feel a call. And I think it was just, as much as I loved Middlebury and the professors were excellent and I stayed because of that, it was a misfit. It was not the right place for me to be nurtured and grow as a international, global person. It sort of stunted my growth, I think, a little bit.
Where did your folks live when you were in Middlebury?
They were in Oklahoma at that time. So they weren't close either. And they were my grounding in the U.S. So we came back for furlough every 4 years, once for the summer, once for a full year. And that was hard. I went through extreme culture shock in 8th grade. I had a really hard time, but by the end of the year I did pretty well. But I had them at home. You know, they were my tie to Korea. I didn't know them without Korea. So for me, my parents, all I knew of them was that they always spoke Korean. They adapted very well culturally. They will not say this of themselves, but they really made an effort to do that, and they did it very well. So I never saw them as like strictly American. I saw them really as a part of Korea as much as part of the US. So when we came back, I had to adjust to realize that they were coming back home in some ways. They love Korea. They're very tied to it as well. But they didn't grow up there. They spent 30 years of their life in the US. So in a way, that was another kind of learning experience I had to go through. And each of my siblings and I have a different story to tell about Korea. My oldest brother was 9 years old, so he went through terrible culture shock when we went there, from Fairfield, Connecticut to Seoul, Korea in 1966. So, yeah.
At the beginning, you said one identity. You only have one identity, you're Rob.
Oh, a single story.
Could you kind of say a little more about that? Because that was an intriguing thought.
What was the question?
That, Dave, that is from a TED Talk by a novelist. And I'll share it with you afterwards, so you can listen to the whole thing. It's really excellent. Let me make sure I get it right. She said, where is it? Okay. So there's a novelist, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. There is a danger in telling a single story to show up people as one thing, and only one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. And she's a bit like me in some ways. She's grown up in different places as well. So she's got an African background. I think she might have been in England for a while. But she was talking about how we size people up so quickly, even when we try not to. I think it's human nature. And she was talking about how she herself did this to people, and she could feel it do it to her, is try to kind of say who they are with one story. Oh, you're from Lincoln. Oh, you're Korean. Oh, you play basketball. Like, it's just one story. We have this one story about people. And we try to create this whole story about them, but there's so much more to that. And one of the things I really learned in writing this book, I think it's a bit of a problem, I think, with third culture kids, is that you can become so kind of isolated that you think no one understands you. And in a way, it's hard for people who didn't grow up like that to understand. But what I realized reading the book is it's a human story. It's really a human story. And the responses I've got from people who've read the book aren't just from people who grew up like me. They're people who have gone through some kind of loss of belonging, loss of identity, some in-betweenness, sometimes bicultural kids with one parent from one race, one parent from another. How do they find themselves within the mix of that? And just depending on your circumstances, it might be something that you struggle with your entire life. So I think what struck me with that is kind of what I'm trying to get at in this book, is that how complicated we are, in all of us.
So you were talking about individuals.
Yeah.
I was thinking, I heard or groups of people.
Well, I think that
I think it
happens
works
as
the
well.
same way.
Sure, exactly.
I like the complexity of it.
Well, one thing that's sort of infuriated me since I moved to Costa Rica is that this happened to me for years when I was growing up. It hasn't happened for a long time. For some reason, Latin America has identified Korea with what? Eating dog meat.
Oh,
Okay, so that has historically been something Koreans did. It's very rare. I saw it maybe once growing up in 16 years. I returned from this April trip, homecoming, this country with 5,000 years of history, ancient palaces, complicated Buddhist sculptures, incredible story of this uprising of a new democratic president. And everyone kept asking me, did you eat dog meat? And it's like you have to stop and just say, okay, this is just a lack of education or knowledge about the world. And people, I think, sometimes get down on the US about things like this, but it's a problem throughout the world. We don't know each other. And when was when I came back from Korea, people would say, "Oh, were you in Vietnam?" Or it's always confusing between. And at first, it kind of bothered me, but then I realized, like, what do I know about, like, Mozambique? What do I know about, the history of Czechoslovakia? I know some, but, so it's easy from our standpoint to think everyone's supposed to know, oh, wait, they don't know a lot about Costa Rica, or they don't know a lot about Korea. Well, a lot of us don't know a lot about countries. We should educate ourselves, but it's not, it's not that person's problem necessarily. I mean, sure, we have to all work on our robbing people of their stories, complicated stories, but yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Well, I know the college now regards Americans who have lived most of their life abroad as foreign students, because I know that the host.
Thank God.
Matches. And I had talked with one young lady whose parents were in the airline business or something, and she had never lived in the United States.
Yeah.
And she was going through the exact cultural disconnect that you experienced. She had visited occasionally.
Yeah.
But the college recognizes that there apparently are enough students there at Middlebury now that need that extra handling and concern.
That's amazing to me. I am so happy to hear that, because there just was no idea about that. And actually it was called Facebook, our book of pictures, It said, Liz Rice, Norman, Oklahoma. It's like my parents are from Niagara Falls, New York. They lived in Oklahoma for a while, but I was suddenly like an Oklahoman, Forget Korea, forget New York. That was, people my friends would know that, but yeah. So how would the college? I'm not sure how that would have happened, but I'm so happy to hear that. It's partly why I wrote the book, is to kind of bring more understanding to that issue. I'm really happy to say there is a lot more being discussed about it now. I think international school kids around the world are much better prepared. There's organizations for kids. There's a mentoring organization if students want a mentor who's been through that before. There's just more language. The language in psychology is there. There's more of an understanding of that. And I wish I would have known to seek that out too, I don't think I knew what was wrong. It's like I wasn't mature enough to really understand it. Just a loss, some kind of loss. So, but I'm really happy to hear that. And I imagine other colleges are doing that as well now. Yeah. Anyone else? No. Well, yes.
I have a question for your parents. Are you aware of the depression that she had at the time when she left and
I wasn't.
Did
I think you-
for college?
You know that I wasn't.
Yeah, I didn't share with them. I don't think, like I said, I didn't have language. I just know I felt.
you probably didn't even know what it was.
I didn't, and I had always been a happy, well-adjusted kid with lots of friends. There was no context for me to kind of have a breakdown. There was no, I didn't have any experience with, I'd had some hard times, relatively speaking, for a teenager, but I didn't have any language for it. So I kind of was quiet about it. And so I think when I told my parents later, it was really surprising. I remember my mom said, "Well, you love Middlebury," and I said, "Yeah, it was not. It was not."
The complication is that my dad went there.
That's right.
Of course, he was so happy that Liz was at Middlebury.
Right.
He didn't have a clue.
My grandfather would come up every homecoming with his leather case with his initials and his gin and tonic bottles. He's classic Middlebury. He was so happy, to have another Rice there. My brother Chris went to Middlebury, Chris, for 2.5 years and then left and went to work in Mississippi. So it was kind of like, okay, I got to stay. I got to do this for Rance. I didn't really know what else to do. I think probably transferring would probably have been the best thing for me. I just needed to be in an international environment. I was 17 when I started, it's young. And I think that's why adults need to know about these things and see the signs in kids who are feeling isolated, or kids who are normally social and active and maybe starting to retreat in ways, yeah. Yes?
You mentioned that you enjoy, or it was mentioned that you enjoy gardening and working with tools, and I have seen you working with tools around
Love it.
projects.
Mm-hmm.
Home in Lincoln. Has that helped you therapeutically, just using your hands?
You know what?
To me, there's sort of a hand-mind thing that can go on.
You know what? It has a lot. It's a good question. I think that, growing up with parents who are in social work, and you kind of have a little bit of a feeling like if you do anything less, how am I helping the world, And so I think I was in nonprofit management for a while, and that was really rewarding. I did enjoy it. But when I first bought a house in Minneapolis and I started working outside and with tools, I realized I loved it. And so my life trajectory, it was kind of like, but could I just do this? It would be okay. Is this enough? But you're right. I found a lot of therapy in that, and I still do. I think, sometimes when you've had a life experience like this, it takes you off of a path of like being able to kind of normally just discover what you like, because you're thinking I should do this or I should do this, or you're hurting, so you're trying to find this, amazing purpose to your life. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think it can kind of derail you from a normal process of saying, what do I love to do? Maybe I like to do carpentry. I think to do it over again, I could have, something like that. So yeah, that's been therapeutic. And even while I was writing the book, if you're writing a book and you're alone at home, it gets long. And doing something like, remodeling a bathroom can be like so nice after trying to write. You're writing and you don't know if what you're writing is any good. You don't know if you're going to publish it someday. You're just grappling with all these things, and so to have that other side of my brain and body exercising was great.
Well, our daughter went to Mount Holyoke, and she couldn't decide what she wanted to do for a major third year, and she looked, all the girls on a track that were envisioning this and that, and she says, I want to go and play in the dirt. That's
Yeah,
what she's doing, and
that's
she loved
awesome.
it. She just could not
Yeah.
really do well in that culture.
Well, I'm learning how to garden in Zone 12 now. Can you imagine?
With monkeys.
Yes.
Well, thank you. I'm sure Elizabeth will stick around some and answer individual questions, but if anyone's interested in purchasing the book, she's got it.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.